Hi, this is Scott Houston, and welcome to Learning with Power. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about William Shakespeare and Julius Caesar. And I've connected them together in the same broadcast because it's relevant. Because actually the image that everybody has of Julius Caesar is actually the one that's depicted in Shakespeare's depiction of him. And in fact, the whole reason why even Cleopatra has been romanticized, and there was a whole movie about Cleopatra, is because of Shakespeare. Mark Antony and all that, it's Shakespeare influenced all of that. So it's important to talk about both of them together. Okay, and so William Shakespeare, as everybody knows, is considered to be one of the greatest wordsmiths in all of English history, in the English history of the English language. And a lot of people love to quote Shakespeare, and you've got a lot of people who love to be thespians, and they're like, "Hell, you're not really a thespian unless you have done the 4 course of Shakespeare." So he's really been embraced by the educated or academic world or whatever as being the most brilliant writer in the English language. And I'm not here to say that he's wasn't very gifted, but I will say that he's highly overrated. And there's a lot of lack of reality when it comes to dealing with Shakespeare and who he really was and what he really did and what it really meant. So let's get to it. First of all, there is an argument that's being made that Shakespeare is not really Shakespeare. That Shakespeare, the person who was from Stratford-on-Avon in England, which was just a little town, could not possibly be the person who has written these magnificent works. And there's a twofold reason for that. One is because since his works have been elevated to such high esteem, so most of these people that are so into Shakespeare and oh, I'm into Shakespeare, I can quote Shakespeare, do it because they feel like it makes them look smart. They think it makes them look sophisticated or educated or smart. That's the whole reason why they're into Shakespeare. Oh, I'm into Shakespeare. Like they're superior somehow. And so if oh, I'm into Shakespeare, he was the most brilliant of all English writers. Well, then you're setting a bar that says that Shakespeare's got to be the most elite. And in reality, as a person, the real person of Shakespeare was not an elite aristocrat, highly educated at all. He was from just a village, basically, and he just went to the basic grammar school. His family wasn't rich. One of the things that's said is that he is a glover's son from Stratford-on-Avon. And so how could a glover's son write such magnificent works? Well, and so basically you have this whole Avon, and so you have the Baconian argument and the Stratfordian argument. Basically, it's a conspiracy theory that says that Shakespeare couldn't have written Shakespeare. And I'm here to tell you that unequivocally, absolutely, it was Shakespeare that wrote Shakespeare. And the real Shakespeare was from just a little town of Stratford-on-Avon. And yes, he only had a grammar school education, which was free education at the time, or relatively free. And sorry, and that's really who he was. The most compelling evidence to support that is that we still have original manuscripts from Shakespeare that is signed in his own hand, William Shakespeare. And the writing, or the style of writing in a signature is endemic within the entire work of literature. And so nobody writes an entire manuscript and signs their name to it in their own hand unless it means something. You know, if anybody were to be trying to fake something, you know, he would have had to have copied it, and you know, and it's ridiculous. Also, and so to talk about, okay, so first of all, the whole conspiracy theory thing started. Really, the argument was first apparently made in 1785, when apparently James Wilmot made the first argument against Shakespeare being the one who wrote Shakespeare. And really, this is just an entirely a classist argument. And so elite upper class people just cannot accept that a person who's not really educated could write something that they have elevated to like being like the top rung of the elite, you know, academic, most brilliant English thing ever written. Okay, and so they just can't deal with the fact that he wasn't, you know, Oxford or Cambridge educated. They just can't deal with it, and it's a classist problem. It's also a problem of ignorance, because people who are ignorant, who have lower IQs, which is most of the world, cannot comprehend how somebody who has a high IQ thinks. It's just, they just can't. That's just a fact of life. It's just, you know, just the way it is. And so I get asked all the time when I come up with some of these ideas that I have in some of my broadcasts, and people say, well, who told you that? Where did you read that? Where did you hear that? Where were you taught that? I was not taught it. I did not read it anywhere. I didn't hear it from anybody. Nobody told me these ideas. I just was able to develop my own ideas. This is what people with high IQs can do. They can develop their own new ideas. Nobody told Einstein about the theory of relativity. It's something he worked out and figured out on his own. Not because he was so highly educated and he was taught something, but because he just worked it out on his own. This is how people with higher IQs work. But people with lower IQs cannot comprehend that, because most people do not know anything past their educational level. So if their highest form of education is in high school, or if the highest degree of education that they have is 4 years of college or whatever, usually they work within that knowledge base, which is usually fine to operate in the world, but they don't really know, or they haven't really learned too much beyond that, other than just what's, you know, talked about in social media. You know, we learn something new every day, they say, but usually it's about what that the Joneses, you know, are getting divorced or something. That's what they've learned. So most people, you know, do not do a lot of independent research. They do not study independently, and so all of the academic behavior that they could do to learn more about just stuff in general, they've ceased. They stopped doing that, and that's most people. And so most people just can't comprehend it. And so it's a class argument, and it's also an argument made by people who like conspiracies and people who generally just don't have that high of an IQ. And there's a lot of people that go to Oxford and Cambridge who do not have a very high IQ. I'm here to tell you, that's a fact. I've been there. Spent time there. Anyway, that's another story. Okay, so the arguments themselves, so you've got the Francis Bacon argument. And now Francis Bacon has the advantage of the fact that at least he lived all during the time that Shakespeare lived. So you don't have that issue. There's another guy named De Vries, or something like that, I think, which is like the favorite one, actually, that people like to use as the Stratfordian, or the anti-Stratfordian argument. But that guy died in 1604, before Shakespeare wrote several other plays, including The Tempest, which is about basically going to the New World, which in 1604 they wouldn't really have known much about. You would have had to have written that after Jamestown. So it's just not possible that that guy could have written those plays. It just isn't. And so the conspiracy theorists try to play with the historical timeline and things like that, and it just gets really messy. And the biggest argument against Francis Bacon is that he actually did write. First of all, he said that he did not like the theater. He was very, very anti-theater, and he thought it was low class. But he actually did write a couple of plays that were performed for the Queen, and they are comically simplistic. So there's no way that the person who wrote those plays for the Queen, so had every motivation to write them well, could have been the same guy that wrote Shakespeare. They're just not possible. And that's the biggest argument against them. But the biggest argument in favor of Shakespeare being the one who wrote Shakespeare is that it's in his hand and he signed the actual play with his own signature, and the play is written in his own handwriting. That's the most compelling argument, that it was actually him. Anyway, okay, so moving on. The reason why they say that Shakespeare couldn't have written these plays is because he was relatively considered to be uneducated. But even in grammar school, in those days, in the 1500s, if it was a proper school, and apparently it was where he was, they would teach you things like Greek and other Latin and Greek. Wait a minute, they taught Latin and Greek to 11 and 12-year-olds in the 1500s? Yes, they did. Huh? Imagine that. Imagine that. Imagine if they tried to do that today. How much trouble they would have with that. Because that's the problem with today. Literally, we've got a dumbing down of society. In the age of information, when we have more access to more information than ever before, the average person works with a smaller knowledge base than they even had in the 1500s. Now, of course, we know more things now. But still, in terms of what you can know, the knowledge base is limited. And most people operate from a very limited knowledge base. And as these iPhone thingies do everything for people now, and Siri and ChatGPT can answer every question now, they're going to be working with smaller and smaller and smaller knowledge bases in the future, unfortunately. But in the 1500s, you had to know stuff on your own because you didn't even have encyclopedias at the time. So, you know. And so we're also pretty sure that Shakespeare is the same guy that went to the school because he actually makes a reference to the actual textbook that was actually used at his grammar school where he went. So that was the actual textbook that they used to teach Greek, and he references it in one of his plays. So Francis Bacon would never have gone to that grammar school and would not have referenced that textbook, for example. Certainly not. And so that's another example. But there's other things too, where if actually some of the things in some of the plays that are represented by Shakespeare are actually factually incorrect. And even though we know more things now than we knew in the 1500s, even in the 1500s, a well-educated person would know that in fact that's factually incorrect. And so like some of the places take place in Italy, and he's got certain things happening that took place actually in other parts of Italy that couldn't have, you know, and so there's a lot of references that are actually not possible. And it's obviously written by someone who had not actually ever gone to Italy, or otherwise you would know these things. And that's one example. Another example is, for example, in one of Shakespeare's very prominent plays, he talks about witches. And he makes a reference to witches in more than one play. But they're prominent in one play. And they're written like, well, of course there's witches. Everybody knows there's witches. You don't have to, and so this is an adult-oriented play intended for adults, and it's talking about witches and magic and things like that, which we know is ridiculous now. And so this is a problem with reproducing Shakespeare's works in a modern, like let's say a modern movie, is because you have to either edit out a lot of stuff like that, or you have to make it something for children. Because quite frankly, if you want to talk about witches in like a realistic way, like they really exist and they really have magic and magic really happens, you have to be talking about something that's written for children. And so, you know, how sophisticated is Shakespeare really? You know, if most of his stuff doesn't play well today, and wouldn't play well today, and actually the actual plot devices and plot points and the actual plot that he actually describes, and the character development is okay, but sometimes it can be a little lacking. I mean, there's a lot of, if you really give it a modern day critique, and you really just look at it, okay, Here's what he wrote. He says, this is the plot. I mean, first of all, they're overly dramatic and overly like grotesque, which you had to do. You had to have that in the theater in England in the 1500s, in the 16th century, because people were mostly uneducated, and they would just be fornicating in the audience if you didn't have exciting things going on stage, like murder and you know, this blood, and everything is gory and dramatic, and you know, it is, you know, overly so, and so it's hard to really take it seriously in a modern sense. A lot of his plays. The reason why Shakespeare really, why he's regarded so highly as being such a brilliant writer, is mainly because of his choice of verbiage and the way that he writes. And it's a very beautiful way to put things, and a beautiful way to write things. And one of the things you have to remember about Shakespeare is mostly he wrote sonnets. He wrote sonnets more often and spent more time writing sonnets than he wrote plays. Plays were just kind of a, well, I can write some plays too and make some money at the Globe Theatre, why not? But mostly he liked writing sonnets. And sonnets were poetry, basically, at the time. And really, actually, they were more song lyrics. So more or less you could consider Shakespeare as being like the Bob Dylan of his day, in a way. But before they had rock and roll music. So here was a guy who had the talent of like Bob Dylan, who could write all these beautiful things and say it in a really beautiful way. So instead of, you know, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind, he can write things like that in beautiful ways, but he doesn't have any music to put it to because the music hasn't been invented yet. So all he has is the lyrics, just the sonnets. And so when you take that type of talent, so imagine Bob Dylan wrote a play. There might be a lot of very beautiful things in that play, worded in a very beautiful way, because he's a wordsmith, and he's got a magical way of putting together words. And so Shakespeare had this talent. He was a magnificent wordsmith, and that's really why he's regarded so highly in English literature as being, you know, one of the most brilliant writers of all time, is because he is such a brilliant wordsmith. Now, some of which, though, some of the stuff that we enjoy today, you know, like wherefore art thou, you know, all that kind of stuff, is just how people talked in those days. So if you read a Marlowe play or something like that, it has all that stuff in it. And it sounds almost like Shakespeare wrote it. It's just that a lot of the really brilliant ways that he implies things and states things, so rather than just stating things obviously, he does it in sort of like a subtle way, in an artistic way, like you were writing some kind of poetry or something. And so that's the really, that's where he stands above, and he's over and above most people, because he was such a brilliant wordsmith. Another thing that was endemic of language, which is called, actually it's Middle English, I guess it's called. And a lot of you'll notice in Shakespeare plays that a lot of sentences end with a verb, which we don't do anymore. We do not end sentences with a verb. In fact, it violates basic sentence structure that we teach today. So, but he has lots of sentences, and so it almost gives you like a Yoda effect in a way. But it sounds cool, you know, but that's just the way that people talked and wrote in those days. That's not because Shakespeare was so brilliant. That's just because that's just a product of the times. So anyway, but I'm not saying that he wasn't a brilliant writer. He was. He was like the Bob Dylan of his day. I mean, you put it that way. I mean, he was a brilliant wordsmith. He was a brilliant poet, and he applied this poetry talent, this wordsmith talent, to a play. And so the whole play is written like almost like it's a poem in a way. And that's why it's so beautiful in a lot of the ways, really interesting, subtle, beautiful ways that he explains things. Even though the actual structure of the actual plot and things like that, it's very simplistic, and a lot of things are over dramatic, and a lot of references are incorrect or actually ignorant, like witches and things like that, despite all that. So one of the things in which Shakespeare shows his ignorance, unfortunately, is when he writes about is when he writes about, Julius Caesar. So Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is very, very sort of flattering of Caesar. And it's very, very, it portrays Caesar as being like some sort of a fallen hero. And then, but that's just the beginning of the play. And then he talks, a lot of it talks about like Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And that's, obviously that relationship has been very, very romanticized. And so as a result, mostly people that collect coins from that time are academics. And so if you're an academic, then you've been bombarded with Shakespeare. And so your image of Julius Caesar is Shakespeare's image of Julius Caesar. And so he romanticizes Caesar, and he romanticizes Mark Antony, and he romanticizes Cleopatra. And that's why all those people are so famous today. That's why they make a big movie about Cleopatra today. That's why they make big movies about Julius Caesar today, or Mark Antony. And it's why their coins are very expensive. There's not really any other reason for it other than Shakespeare. So, the way that he wrote, so let me see if I have all these things. So that's the Shakespeare part of what I'm talking about. Okay. And so, okay. So, now we're going to get to Caesar. Oh. Actually, before I get to Caesar, let me cover these things. Two very important points that I forgot to mention in my last episode, which is talking about ideas. The problem with credit, and the reason why we need a credit court, is because all you can do to fight bad credit is just to try to prove that it's not you. That they've got the wrong social security number, the wrong name, whatever they've got, it's not you. Or that the person who is making the claim against you is just someone who bought the paper, but they don't actually have an original agreement that you agreed to. So if they don't have access to the original contract, then they can't really enforce that agreement if that agreement now has been invalidated by it being carried by somebody else. And so that's another argument that you can make. But those are really the only ways that you can defend yourself. And that's not enough. And that's a big problem with the system, big flaw in the system. Okay, also when I was talking about the cardboard plunger being made out of just cardboard, and I said coat it in plastic, I didn't mean that. I meant you would dip it and coat it in wax. Coat it in wax. That's what I meant to say, wax. Okay. So I covered those points. I know it's out of order. I should have done it at the beginning of the program, but I didn't. So now let's talk about the real Julius Caesar. And who was Julius Caesar really? And let's get away from the Shakespeare Julius Caesar, and let's talk about really who was Julius Caesar. First of all, let's talk about the way that Shakespeare represents Julius Caesar. Okay, so he romanticizes him. Also, they've made two movies about Julius Caesar, one in 1953, and then they did it again in 1970. And actually, in my opinion, the 1970 one, even though it has much lower rating, was the much better one. The only reason the 1953 one has a higher rating is because it was the first one, and it was done in 1953, so it's the most famous one. But there's a lot of things about, even within the movie, that you can tell comes straight from Shakespeare. And is not actually about Julius Caesar or about those times. It's not actually a factual movie about those times. It's actually just a movie about Julius Caesar's version of Shakespeare. And one of the things that you can just see in the movie is they reference humors in the movie a lot. That comes straight from Shakespeare. That's a 1500s term. They did not use terminology like that during Roman times. They wouldn't have used terminology in Roman times. Also, the 1953 movie shows Mason with he's holding a codex. He's one of the primary characters in the play. And in the play, he's holding a codex, what's called a codex, which we know now as a book. Well, James Mason, they didn't have codexes or books in Julius Caesar's time. They didn't come around until like the 4th century. So for him to be holding a codex, that's not possible. That's not historically accurate. They'd be holding a scroll. Everything was written that way at the time. Pretty much everything. And so, basically, the way that Shakespeare portrays Caesar is that Caesar was this noble and great guy, and that the only reason they murdered him right there on the Senate floor in this really dramatic way, and so the fact that they murdered him on the Senate floor is so gory and dramatic, that lends itself to attracting Caesar, or Shakespeare, to wanting to write about it. Yeah, murder on the Senate floor, and then this romance between Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and then they like the final battle is like, you know, the end. Wow, that's stuff. That's good fodder. That's good stuff to write a play about. That's why he did it. And so he basically portrays it as being like Shakespeare was only murdered because everybody was jealous of him. He had so much power and he was so amazing. People were jealous. They couldn't stand it anymore. They'd had enough of him, like he's Donald Trump or something, and they stabbed him. They couldn't take him anymore. He was just too full of himself. And so he's like this fallen hero, this romanticized character. And then the movie, or his play, and the movies in 53 and 1970, then go on to more or less portray Cassius as the real antagonist. So in those plays of Caesar's, which also in the movies, the antagonist, if you just look at it as far as how it breaks down, is actually the antagonist, is Cassius. Cassius is the antagonist. And that's not really how history was. But when you're writing a play, you have to have an antagonist, so he chose to make it Cassius. Okay, which makes sense, but it's not historical. All right, so what's historical? Well, historical is that Caesar was a very bad person and probably needed to be and deserved to be assassinated by the senators, because in fact he was destroying the power of the Senate. That's really what he did. And if you want to compare Donald Trump to him, not that I dislike Donald Trump, but I can understand comparisons to him to Julius Caesar, because he's literally trying to do the same thing. He's trying to circumvent normal processes of like the judges, of like the Supreme Court, or of like Congress and things like that. He's pushing the limits of his authority and of his power and testing it as much as he can. And though he may not be technically violating any laws, he's pushing the limits. And he's not respecting the process, and he's not respecting the rule of law. It's my will, and I want to do what my will is, and my will be done, and we are going to do my will. And you know, the political structure that existed in 44 BC was not as strong as the political structure that we have today. And so when you have a guy like Julius Caesar, who's the same sort of character, who's pushing the edges of his authority as far as he can push it, he gets away with a lot of stuff, but essentially what he did was he eliminated and dissolved the whole need for a Senate. Now, for 150 years before Caesar, starting with Pompey, and it's ironic that in the movie he actually is assassinated and dies by Pompey's statue, because it's actually Pompey that in real life he most egregiously defied, you could say. So basically, Rome was a republic, and it was basically like a democracy, and like a modern day, like a modern day Britain, where the Parliament, or the Senate, you could say, had a tremendous amount of power, and everything had to be voted upon within the Senate, and so you had a representative democracy at that time, and it was actually a very effective form of democracy, or form of government. And what Shakespeare does not have the benefit of is he does not have the benefit of all of the philosophers and Voltaire and those people, and the people that whose wisdom the forefathers of the United States drew upon from the 18th century, the early 18th century, and created, you know, the documents that founded the United States, and the democracy and the Senate and the Congress that we have today. All that comes straight from the Roman Republic. So for that 150 years before Caesar, that's what it's drawn upon. And it's still an effective way of government now. I've talked about the fallacies of democracy in one of my past episodes, but basically that's all Western government now is based on the Roman Republic, which is the government that existed in Rome before Caesar. So from like Pompeii, so from like 190 BC down to 44 BC, that period of time. And in history, it just seems like it's a blip, like that. This is 150 years, blip. You know, what's the difference between 190 BC and 44 BC? Blip. Not much, right? To us. But at the time, it was 150 years of everything going fine. I mean, that's a long time. And then suddenly somebody comes around and he starts stepping over all of these, maybe not necessarily laws that are written in stone, literally at the time, but just procedure, the way you do things, the accepted ways to do things. And so they really had regretted that they allowed Caesar to become the top guy or the head of the Senate or whatever. They really regretted that because he made himself an emperor. And the thing is, once that happened, then you weren't going to go back. Because nobody beyond that who was made emperor was going to be willing to give up that authority or that power. I mean, it's just not a natural human thing to want to do. So so you have this, then after Caesar, you have this triumvirate. And you have Mark Antony and Brutus and Octavius, who later became Augustus, fighting with each other over who's going to now be the next emperor. They weren't fighting over each other so that they could be the head of the Senate, you know, the top person in Congress or something like that. They were fighting each other over who was going to be emperor. And so that began the era of emperors in Rome, which ran all the way into the Byzantine Empire, all the way to the end of the Byzantine Empire. And there was no longer a Roman Republic. It was gone. And essentially the Roman Republic was destroyed by Julius Caesar. He destroyed the Roman Republic. It was dead. It was over. And so he actually was a very bad person in history. And he should not be romanticized and revered and, oh, what a shame, such a tragic hero. You know, and there's things that if you look at the movies in 53 or 1970, both of them have the way that they talked about Julius Caesar, is like a very romanticized, a fallen hero. He was a great man, you know, that kind of thing. But actually, it was good. They needed to kill him. Unfortunately, they could not bring back the power of the Senate. And they didn't actually do that in the West. Bring back that type of authority, that sort of a limitation on absolute authority, on absolute power. That didn't start to happen until 1215 when they got King John to sign the Magna Carta. But then even after King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, the Parliament still didn't really exist for like another 100 years. It's because the subsequent kings just summarily ignored the Magna Carta. They didn't care. It wasn't until there was actually a fairly weak king many years later that they were actually able to put together some kind of a parliament and actually were able to start establishing some parliamentary power, which then began to grow and grow and grow. But for like 100 years, really, after the signing of the Magna Carta, there was technically a parliament, but they didn't really have any power. You know, it was just a name only. And so that 1,300 years passed with no parliament or any kind of checks on absolute authority. That was the way Western government was, and that was not good. And that was all thanks to Julius Caesar. He created that big mess that basically ultimately caused the fall of the Roman Empire, probably, and it made life hard for the average person for the next over 1,000 years. So, and that's the real Julius Caesar. Okay, so I guess that about covers it. This was which episode is this, Ed? 33?
Yeah, I believe so.
Pardon me.
It should be 33.
Should be on top of these things. I believe it's episode 33. So thank you for joining us for this episode. Please stay tuned for the next episode, which is going to be delayed. Well, okay, two announcements I want to make. One, I had intended to do as the next episode, the world in 2000 BC. But what happened in history between 3000 BC and 2000 BC really is all about ancient Egypt. And my very good friend for the last 40 years, who lives not too far away in North Carolina, has said that he would help me, but you know, he's vacillating and he's being hard to nail down to a time, so I don't know when that's going to happen. And now I'm going to be going overseas. So we're not going to have an episode for probably another month or so, and the next episode I had intended to be 2000 BC, but I don't know if or when that's going to happen. So we're going to skip that one. I'm going to revisit it later on whenever it suits the schedule of my friend, because that's really who I would like to do an episode on Egyptology, because that really is the person who's the authority on Egyptology, and he's a worldwide authority on Egyptology legitimately, much more than me in any case. And so I'm going to move on to 1000 BC. And so my next episode, when I do come back, is going to be the world in 1000 BC. And we'll start with that. And until then, we'll see you next time. Stay in touch. Stay tuned. Look at all the episodes up till now. Subscribe, like, share with your friends. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. I'm Scott Houston.